Several lines of evidence support the historicity of the Gospels, at least enough to obtain a level of trustworthiness when compared to other historical documents. The sticking point is miracles, we all know this. According to skeptics, the Gospel writers invented miracle stories to make Jesus appear more than an ordinary vagabond preacher. So Jesus was made out to be a miracle worker greater than Elijah and Elisha combined, or at least that's the way the explanation goes. This legendary development theory does have one fatal flaw. It completely ignores the earliest periods of church history. Besides assuming the miracles of Jesus, the book of Acts shows that, by their own testimony, miracles were still happening within the church. Peter healed the beggar at the Beautiful Gate, Philip performed signs and wonders in Samaria, and Paul heals a lame man in Lystra. The book of Acts even ends up with Paul healing crowds in the island of Malta. The man Peter healed expected to receive some spare change, not a miracle, and the lame man at Lystra was probably a pagan who didn't expect to walk that day until Paul began to preach Jesus. These two men healed had no apparent predisposing circumstances for credulity or religious enthusiasm. This is noteworthy and deserves our attention. Now, I'm sure someone is going to say, come on, Luke is obviously making this stuff up. Fair enough, but Luke is considered by many scholars to be a painstakingly accurate historian. He shows himself to be correct about dozens of minute details, and historian Colin Hemmer gives us a list of 84 times that Luke gets little particulars that only someone close up to the facts would be able to get right. However, this might be an example of what some call the Spider-Man fallacy. Just because Spider-Man comics name real places and people in New York City doesn't make Spider-Sense real. But then we turn to Paul's uncontested letters, where he claims to perform miracles with a straight face. In 2 Corinthians 12:12, Paul says, "The signs of a true apostle were performed among you with utmost patience, signs and wonders and mighty works." We also see similar language from Paul in Romans 15:18-19. He writes, "For I will not venture to speak of anything except what Christ has accomplished through me to win obedience to the Gentiles, by word and deed, by power of signs and wonders, by the power of the Spirit of God, so that from Jerusalem as far as Illyricum I have fully proclaimed the good news of Christ." Notice how Paul said earlier that miracles were marks of a true apostle. The first two chapters of Galatians tell us that Paul spent time with other apostles, including Peter for a couple of weeks, as well as James and John. And in 1 Corinthians, we read that the church in Corinth was already familiar with Peter and possibly other apostles. Now, think about when Paul wrote. Paul penned 1 Corinthians around 53 AD, according to most scholars. 2 Corinthians came a couple years later in around 55. Paul's initial visit to the Corinthians was in 51. If these miracles were just placebo effects that eventually faded away, why did Paul so boldly remind the church of them several years later? Paul was writing in response to some of the quote-unquote super apostles who were false teachers that became very popular among the Corinthians. Paul is saying that he might not have their eloquence, but he definitely has power, just like the original Jerusalem apostles had. And this wasn't just Corinth either. Paul writes of miracles and works of power to the Galatians as well as the Thessalonians. And again, he writes to the Romans as if this was an already well-known fact about his reputation. In the history of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, Edward Gibbon makes a relevant observation. He writes, "It may seem somewhat remarkable that Bernard of Clairvaux, who records so many miracles of his friend St. Malachi, never takes any of his own, which in their turn, however, are related to his companions and disciples. In the long series of ecclesiastical history, does there exist a single instance of a saint asserting that he possessed the gift of miracles?" Now, for those of you who don't know, Gibbon was a deist and very critical of revealed religion. This challenge might be difficult if he means ecclesiastical history is separable from apostolic history, till maybe more modern times at least. Gibbon was writing in the 1700s. However, if it includes the first 20 years of Christianity, that challenge is explicitly met by the passages I've quoted here. I believe that this is confirmation of the hypothesis that the foundation of Christianity is supernatural. This proof comes in letters written by a man who pours his very soul into the people for whom he writes. I mean, let's just think about Paul for just a moment. In his epistles, we learn that he financed his own missionary journeys by manual labor rather than receiving financial support. Obviously, he wasn't in the ministry for money. He also refused to marry and preached stringent sexual ethics. Paul wasn't in the ministry to serve his own appetites. And during the Corinthians' controversy over who their favorite apostle was, Paul called them a bunch of spiritual babies. He wasn't in ministry to receive honor from men. Paul testified to being lashed 39 times on 5 separate occasions, receiving a beating with rods 3 different times, as well as being once stoned and left for dead. He was continually on the move, regularly in labor, and constantly in danger. Paul was nothing if not sincere. So here's the bottom line. Paul believed that he worked miracles just like the other apostles, which would include Jesus' earliest followers. Therefore, there's little reason to doubt that Jesus himself performed miracles, since he was the very founder of their faith. As far as Paul is concerned, his evidence converges with that of the other gospel writers, that Christianity had miraculous origins. New Testament scholar and historian Paula Friedrichsen, who is not a Christian, concludes, yes, I think that Jesus probably did perform deeds that contemporaries viewed as miracles. Those I have the least trouble imagining his working conformed to those also named by Paul, healings and exorcisms. So Jesus' authority wasn't added to by the four evangelists by inventing healings and exorcisms in the midst of large crowds. These would have come to no surprise in the early church, since they already heard about them orally probably, and witnessed them through the apostles themselves. The legendary development hypothesis to explain away Jesus' miracles is therefore rendered as unhelpful and unnecessary.